Jae-sung stood tall, a sneer playing on his young face as he looked down at Martha. His crew, a tight circle of men, watched him, some with smirks, others just blank. Martha, an older black woman, just stood there, quiet, her hands clasped in front of her. Jae-sung laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the low hum of the room. "Look at her," he said, waving a hand in Martha's direction. His voice was loud, meant to carry, meant to mock. "Still clinging to that old-fashioned kindness? What good is that now, huh? In this world, that stuff just makes you weak." He paused, letting his words sink in, scanning his men for their approval. A few nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Martha didn't flinch. Her eyes, dark and deep, met his. There was no anger there, no fear, just a steady, calm gaze that seemed to see right through him. Jae-sung found it annoying. He saw her quietness as a sign she didn't get it, that she was just too old, too slow. He thought her wisdom was just senility, a soft fading of the mind. "Her outdated kindness," he continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "has no place in my world. My world is about strength, about taking what you want, not baking cookies and offering prayers." He chuckled again, and this time, a few more of his men joined in, a nervous ripple of laughter. Martha just watched him, her expression unchanging. But then, something shifted, almost too small to notice, a tiny tightening around her eyes, a subtle straightening of her shoulders. It was barely there, yet it was enough to make the air in the room feel different. She took a slow breath, and then she spoke. Her voice was low, clear, and steady, cutting through the lingering echoes of Jae-sung's laughter. "Some lessons are learned the hard way, child," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected weight. She didn't raise it, didn't shout, but every word landed with a quiet force. "And some kindness, once given, carries a debt you can't repay." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The room went silent. Jae-sung's smirk faltered. He stared at her, his young face momentarily blank, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. Not by anyone, and especially not by someone he thought was beneath him. Her calm, cryptic response had caught him off guard, leaving him with an unfamiliar feeling, a slight unease that pricked at his usual confidence. Martha didn't wait for a reply. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She walked past Jae-sung and his silent crew, her back straight, heading for the door. As she reached it, a gust of wind rattled the glass, and through the window, the first fat flakes of snow began to fall. The sky outside had turned a bruised purple, and the wind was picking up, promising a harsh winter storm. The weather was brewing, a powerful blizzard just beginning to gather its strength. Martha opened the door, and the cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of snow. She stepped out, her words still echoing in the hushed room, a quiet prophecy hanging in the air. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Martha's words, a quiet prophecy, were born from a life lived deeply, far from the cold, calculated world Jae-sung knew. To understand her unwavering calm, we need to go back in time, to the late 1980s, to a different Chicago, a different neighborhood. It was a place where brick buildings lined streets filled with the sounds of children playing, gospel music drifting from open windows, and the rhythmic clatter of the elevated train overhead. This was Martha's world, a close-knit, predominantly African-American community that pulsed with life and resilience. She lived in a modest two-story home with a small, well-tended garden in the back. The scent of her baking often wafted down the street, peach cobbler, sweet potato pie, yeast rolls warm from the oven. Martha wasn't just a good cook. She was the neighborhood's anchor. She was the one who listened without judgment, who offered a warm meal to anyone in need, who knew every child's name and every elder's story. Her wisdom wasn't loud or demanding. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, shared over cups of tea or during quiet moments on her porch swing. People came to her for advice, for comfort, or just for a slice of pie and a moment of peace. She was a respected elder, her presence a steadying force in a world that was always changing. Her routine was simple but meaningful. Mornings began with prayer and coffee, followed by tending her garden or baking something for a neighbor. Afternoons were spent volunteering at the local community center, helping kids with homework or visiting the sick. Evenings brought quiet reflection, often with a book in her lap, the subtle hum of the city a constant backdrop. Yet, this vibrant community faced its share of struggles. Economic hardship cast a long shadow, jobs were scarce, and the specter of burgeoning gang activity was slowly starting to creep into their lives, threatening the peace Martha worked so hard to maintain. It was into this complex tapestry that the Korean immigrant community began to weave itself. They were new arrivals, many having fled war or seeking better opportunities, and they often faced immense prejudice. They struggled to establish small businesses, laundromats, convenience stores, dry cleaners, in the same areas, striving to carve out their own piece of the American dream. Language barriers, cultural differences, and the existing social structures made their integration challenging. They were outsiders, often viewed with suspicion by both the established white power structures and, at times, by the existing African American residents who felt their own struggles were being overlooked. Jae-sung, then a young man barely out of his teens, was a product of this environment. He was part of a nascent Korean gang, fiercely loyal to his own, driven by a desperate need for belonging and protection in a hostile world. His family had faced discrimination, their small business vandalized, their dreams constantly threatened. He saw the world as a place where only the strong survived, where trust was a luxury and kindness a weakness. His initial encounters with Martha were brief, often just quick transactions at the corner store his uncle owned, or a fleeting glance as he moved through the neighborhood with his crew. He saw an old woman, a relic of a bygone era, and felt nothing but a vague sense of annoyance at her quiet presence. His distrust of outsiders was deeply ingrained, a shield against the harsh realities he'd grown up with. He saw her community as just another obstacle, another group that might stand in the way of his crew's rise. Martha, on the other hand, carried a deep-seated belief in humanity, a conviction that kindness was not weakness but strength. She saw beyond the hardened exteriors, always searching for the flicker of good she believed resided in everyone. This profound contrast set the stage. Jae-sung, with his growing ambition in the criminal underworld, his hardened pragmatism, and his belief in power above all else, was on an inevitable collision course with the values Martha embodied. Their worlds were about to meet, and the impact would be far greater than either of them could have imagined. As Jae-sung's crew grew, so did the emotional cracks in the community. His interactions, and those of his men, started to leave subtle but noticeable scars. It wasn't always direct violence, but a slow erosion of trust, a constant chipping away at the foundation of neighborly respect. There were times, for instance, when a small Korean-owned grocery store, under the gang's protection, would suddenly charge a few extra cents for a loaf of bread or a carton of milk, prices just high enough to feel unfair, but not enough to cause an open rebellion. people knew it was the gang's doing, a quiet tax on their already thin wallets. These small increases might seem minor, but for families struggling to make ends meet, every penny counted. Martha saw the worried faces of her friends, the way they would sigh and pay, avoiding eye contact. Then there were the promises. Jae-sung's crew would occasionally offer to help local shopkeepers with their security, promising to keep rival gangs away. But these promises often came with a steep price, a weekly payment that felt more like extortion than protection. If a shop owner hesitated, a window might mysteriously get broken overnight, or a delivery truck might be delayed. These weren't overt threats, but they were clear enough. Martha's friend, Mr. Henderson, who ran the local hardware store, had his front door spray painted one night, after he politely declined the gang's generous offer. He never spoke about it directly, but Martha saw the fear in his eyes, the way he started closing his shop earlier, the vibrant spirit slowly draining from him. The gang also had a way of disrespecting local customs, especially those of the elders. They would play loud music late into the night, ignoring complaints from residents trying to sleep. Young gang members would hang out on street corners, blocking sidewalks, making elderly women like Martha feel uneasy walking to church or the market. It wasn't aggressive, but it was dismissive, a clear sign that they felt above the traditional rules of the neighborhood. Martha once saw Jae-sung himself, leaning against a lamppost, watching as one of his younger members rudely pushed past an older woman carrying groceries without offering to help. He just watched, a blank look on his face, as if it were perfectly normal. These moments, though seemingly small, built up over time. They illustrated a growing gap between the two communities. For Jae-sung, it was all part of the game, a way to show who was in charge, to expand their influence. He saw it as business, as necessary steps to solidify his power in a cutthroat world. He was learning to manipulate, to intimidate, to control. The moral erosion within his group was clear, not just in their actions, but in their attitude. They were becoming harder, more detached from the human connection that held the neighborhood together. The audience, looking back at Jae-sung's mockery of Martha in Part 1, could now understand. It wasn't just a random act of disrespect. It was the result of years of this escalating disregard for traditional values. It showed his complete embrace of his criminal identity, a shield he had built around himself. The values Martha represented, kindness, community, respect for elders, were not just outdated to him. They were weaknesses, things that could be exploited, things that had no place in the harsh reality he had created for himself. He had become fully immersed in his role, believing that only power and intimidation held any real sway in the world. He had closed himself off to any other way of thinking, any other way of being. The tension in the neighborhood grew thicker, like the humid Chicago air before a summer storm. The Korean gang's activities were no longer subtle. What started as veiled threats and quiet intimidation had escalated into something much more overt and disruptive. Conflicts over territory and influence became a regular occurrence. Gunshots, once a rare and shocking sound, were now heard with unsettling frequency, often at night, echoing down alleyways and through residential streets. These skirmishes weren't just with rival gangs anymore. Sometimes they involved local business owners who had finally pushed back, or residents who had dared to stand up for themselves. The increased violence brought with it an increased police presence, but it felt less like protection and more like an occupation. Squad cars patrolled constantly, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on familiar streets. This only added to the fear, making everyone feel like they were living in a war zone. caught between two warring factions. The police, often seen as outsiders themselves, didn't seem to understand the nuances of the community, and their heavy-handed tactics sometimes made things worse, creating more resentment than safety. Discussions among neighbors and family members shifted from quiet complaints to open fear. People spoke in hushed tones on their front porches, their eyes darting around nervously. The once vibrant park, usually filled with children playing, became eerily quiet, especially in the evenings. Parents kept their kids indoors, and elderly residents locked their doors earlier. Martha, though she carried herself with her usual calm dignity, felt the pressure of this rising anxiety. She saw the worry etched on the faces of her friends, the way they clutched their purses tighter, the hurried steps they took when walking alone. She tried to offer words of comfort, to remind them of their resilience, but even her steady presence couldn't fully ease the growing sense of dread. Jae-sung, meanwhile, became even more aggressive, more unyielding. He walked with a swagger that dared anyone to challenge him. His desire to solidify his power was clear in every move he made, every order he gave. He ignored the quiet warnings from within his own ranks, those older, wiser members who saw the danger in pushing too hard, too fast. They tried to tell him that alienating the community completely would backfire, that a gang needed at least some grudging acceptance to truly thrive. But Jae-sung was deaf to their caution. He saw it as weakness, as a lack of resolve. His ambition blinded him to the consequences, making him believe that sheer force was the only path to absolute control. He was convinced that if he just pushed hard enough, everyone would fall in line. The neighborhood felt suffocated. The escalating violence was a constant weight pressing down on everyone. People felt trapped, caught in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. The perceived indifference of the authorities only made things worse. It seemed like no one cared, that their pleas for intervention fell on deaf ears. Martha felt this heightened emotional burden more acutely than most. She was a pillar of her community, and she carried the weight of their silent pleas, their unspoken suffering. She saw the worn-out faces, the tired eyes, the way hope seemed to be draining from the streets. This was the peak of emotional suffocation, a boiling point before something had to give. The air was thick with unspoken fear, a palpable tension that hung over every street corner, every home. Everyone knew something had to change, but no one knew how or when. Then, as if the universe itself decided enough was enough, a devastating blizzard hit Chicago. It wasn't just a heavy snowfall, it was a whiteout. A true paralyzing storm that brought the entire city to a standstill. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping snow into thick, blinding curtains. Temperatures plummeted, making every breath a burning ache in the lungs. Streets disappeared under drifts of snow, and visibility dropped to almost zero. It was the kind of storm that made people huddle indoors, praying for it to pass. Jae-sung, despite all his street smarts and his crew's preparations, was caught completely off guard by the storm's ferocity. He had underestimated the power of nature, just as he had underestimated the quiet strength of Martha. He and a few of his closest enforcers were ambushed during the whiteout by a rival gang. The fight was brutal, quick, and almost invisible in the swirling snow. They were hit hard, their usual advantage in numbers and planning wiped out by the blinding conditions. When the rival gang retreated, leaving them for dead in the snow, Jae-sung and his men were left critically injured, bleeding, and freezing. They were far from their territory, miles from any safe house or familiar face. The blizzard had turned their usual routes into impassable white landscapes. Their resources, usually just a phone call away, were inaccessible. Cell service was spotty, roads were blocked, and no one was venturing out in that weather. They were vulnerable, desperate, and utterly alone against the elements. The cold was a physical thing, seeping into their bones, promising a slow, silent end. Jae-sung, who had always prided himself on control, found himself completely powerless, lying in a snowdrift, feeling his body growing numb. Martha, meanwhile, was not one to be deterred by a little snow. Her concern for her elderly neighbors outweighed her desire for warmth. Wrapped in layers of thick wool, her head covered by a scarf, she ventured out, a thermos of hot tea and a bag of homemade biscuits clutched in her gloved hands. She moved slowly, carefully, her familiar street transformed into an alien landscape. The wind pushed against her, biting at any exposed skin, but she kept going, driven by her quiet sense of duty. It was during one of these checks, on a street a few blocks from her own, that she stumbled upon them. A dark huddle against a snowbank, almost completely covered by fresh drifts. At first she thought it was just debris, but then she saw a hand, unnaturally pale, sticking out. Her heart caught in her throat. She moved closer, pushing aside the snow, and saw the faces. Blood stained the white snow crimson. It was Jae-sung, barely conscious, his face a mask of pain and shock, and two of his men, one unconscious, the other moaning softly. She recognized Jae-sung instantly, the young man who had mocked her, whose actions had caused so much fear in her community. A wave of conflicting emotions hit her: anger, fear, and then something deeper, something that transcended all the bad blood. They were human beings, freezing to death. Against all expectations, and against what many in her community would have advised, Martha made a decision. It was a life-altering choice, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation. She couldn't leave them. She wouldn't. This act of profound, unconditional kindness in their moment of ultimate helplessness completely shattered Jae-sung's worldview. It broke the cycle of his suffering, exposing the truth of human connection beyond power and fear. With immense effort, she managed to get Jae-sung and one of his less injured men to help carry the third unconscious man. Slowly, painfully, she guided them through the swirling snow back towards her small, warm home. She was bringing the injured, freezing gang members into her sanctuary. She would provide shelter, warmth, and basic first aid, saving their lives. The immediate aftermath was quiet, almost surreal. Jae-sung and his two men lay on blankets on Martha's living room floor, still shivering, but no longer fighting the bone-deep cold. The heat from her old radiator slowly began to thaw them. They were in shock, their minds reeling from the near-death experience and the unexpected mercy shown by the woman they had so casually disrespected. Martha moved around them, a quiet presence, fetching towels, a basin of warm water, and a first aid kit. She didn't say much, just soft murmurs about needing to get them warm, to clean their wounds. She cleaned their cuts and scrapes with steady hands, her movements efficient and practiced. She applied antiseptic, wrapped bandages, and gently covered them with more blankets. There was no judgment in her eyes, no "I told you so" in her actions. She simply acted. She brought the mugs of steaming ginger tea, thick with honey, and a plate of warm buttered bread. They ate slowly, hesitantly, the simple food tasting like a feast after the ordeal. Each sip of tea, each bite of bread, was a small act of grace, a quiet testament to her unwavering compassion. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside Martha's small home, a fragile peace had settled. Her neighbors, however, were not so peaceful. News traveled fast, even in a snowstorm. Mrs. Peterson, Martha's next-door friend, braved the snow to knock on her door. Her face was etched with worry. "Martha, what are you doing? These are those boys. It's not safe," she whispered, glancing nervously at the figures on the floor. Martha just shook her head gently. "They're just boys, Mary. Hurt and freezing. I couldn't leave them out there." Some neighbors, hearing the news, were scared, questioning Martha's judgment, worried for her safety. But others, like old Mr. Henderson, who had known Martha for decades, simply nodded. They understood her heart, even if they didn't understand her actions. They saw her unwavering compassion and were deeply moved, though still fearful. For Jae-sung and his men, the situation was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. They understood the concept of in-yon, the fated relationship that binds people together, sometimes across lifetimes. They had always believed in Han, a deep-seated sense of injustice and unresolved resentment. But this act of kindness, this selfless rescue, shattered their understanding of both. They were now indebted to Martha in a way they never anticipated, a debt far deeper than money or power. It was a debt of life itself. The shame burned through Jae-sung more fiercely than any physical pain. He remembered his mocking words, his arrogant dismissal of her wisdom. He saw his actions, his entire life's philosophy, laid bare and challenged by one woman's simple, selfless act. He lay there, watching Martha, a small, strong woman, moving with quiet dignity, and felt the weight of his past actions more acutely than any physical injury. His pride was broken, his hardened exterior cracked. He had built his world on power, fear, and control, only to be saved by kindness, vulnerability, and a complete lack of self-interest. He had always believed in taking, in asserting dominance, but Martha had given, unconditionally. The contrast was stark, almost unbearable. His mind, usually sharp and strategic, was now a confused mess of gratitude, shame, and a dawning, terrifying realization that everything he thought he knew was wrong. This blizzard, this ambush, and especially Martha's intervention, had not just saved his life. They had utterly dismantled it. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the blankets, a stark reminder of his own cold heart. Martha slowly reestablished her routine after the blizzard, but things were subtly different. She still baked, still tended her small garden when the snow melted, still shared stories with her neighbors. Yet, an unseen shadow of protection now followed her. Jae-sung, after he and his men had fully recovered and quietly left her home, had not forgotten. He made no grand declarations, no public displays of gratitude. Instead, he made a quiet, powerful vow of protection to Martha, a debt of life that transcended his criminal ties. This debt manifested in small, almost imperceptible ways at first. The young men who once loitered aggressively on street corners near Martha's home were gone. The occasional petty theft that used to plague the neighborhood suddenly stopped. If a window broke, it was fixed the next day, no questions asked. If a car belonging to one of Martha's elderly neighbors broke down, help seemed to materialize out of nowhere. Jae-sung and his crew became an unseen force for good, a silent guardian over Martha and her community. Their presence was a quiet hum, not a shout. The consequence for Jae-sung's past behavior was not punishment, but a profound transformation. His leadership within the Mafia began to change. He still held power, but he started channeling it differently. The protection rackets shifted, becoming genuine protection for vulnerable businesses, not extortion. He redirected his crew's energies, subtly at first, then more overtly, towards maintaining order and preventing escalation of violence in Martha's neighborhood. He didn't become a saint overnight, but his focus narrowed, centering on the people he now felt responsible for. He had a debt to repay, and it extended beyond just Martha. The neighborhood experienced a gradual, almost miraculous shift. The crime rate, which had steadily climbed, began to decrease. The rival gangs, who once openly challenged Jae-sung's authority, found themselves facing a more unified, disciplined, and unexpectedly protective force. There was an unspoken understanding that Martha's block, and by extension, her entire community, was off limits for trouble. A new, strange respect emerged between the Korean gang and the local residents. It wasn't a friendship, not exactly, but a truce, a quiet acknowledgement of shared space and an unexpected common purpose. People still remembered the past, but they also saw the present, and the present was safer. Years passed. Martha grew older, her steps a little slower, her hair a little whiter. She still lived in her small house, filled with the scent of baking bread and old memories. One crisp autumn afternoon, Martha sat on her porch swing, watching the leaves fall. A sleek black car, the kind she recognized but never saw clearly, drove slowly past, then paused a block away. A figure emerged, tall and composed, his face lined with the years, his demeanor still carrying an air of quiet authority. It was Jae-sung, now an older, respected figure, no longer the arrogant young man who had mocked her. He didn't approach. He simply stood there for a moment, observing, making sure everything was as it should be. Martha simply smiled, a knowing, gentle curve of her lips. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of continued vigilance, and then got back into his car, disappearing around the corner. The resolution was satisfying, a testament to the unexpected bonds forged in the face of adversity. True power, Martha had always believed, lay not in dominance or fear, but in the ripple effect of genuine human connection. Her single act of kindness that cold, snowy night had changed the trajectory of many lives. It had transformed a hardened criminal into a guardian, and a fearful community into a protected one. That protection, earned through her selflessness, had lasted a lifetime, proving that some debts, once given, carry a weight far greater than any material wealth, and that kindness, truly given, can echo through generations.